Rules Committee will come to order, and thank you very much. If it's 5 o'clock, it must be Monday at the Rules Committee when we get together. I want to thank every one of you for joining the committee today as we consider H.R. 3590, the Sportsman Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act of 2013. This bipartisan legislation is comprised of 8 smaller bills, each designed to promote recreational outdoor activities to protect hunting and fishing opportunities for millions of Americans. According to the 2011 National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation, American sportsmen contribute roughly $90 billion in economic activity every year within America. These revenues sustain thousands of American jobs and support vital conservation projects to protect our nation's unparalleled natural resources, including our waterways and fields. Unfortunately, all too often, the federal government erects unnecessary barriers which prevent Americans from participating in these lifetime activities available on federal lands. This week, Congress has the opportunity to streamline federal regulations, increase access to federal lands for the purpose of hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting, and to promote sportsmen views by giving them a seat at the table through an innovative advisory committee. I want to thank our great chairman, the former member of this Rules Committee from the Natural Resources Committee, Doc Hastings. Also, I'd like to thank Co-Chairman Latta from Ohio and Co-Chairman Thompson from Mississippi, who each have used their leadership through the committee and with Chairman Hastings for this legislation that we offer today. I would add also that I believe that this is a bipartisan and bicameral bill with the expectation that this has been worked through not only with the administration, but also worked carefully with the Senate to make sure that these bills will offer sportsmen and the American people, as well as the taxpayer, a better opportunity in conservation efforts. I'd like to, if I can, at this time yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts for any opening statement he may choose to make. Gentleman is recognized.
I have no opening statement, Mr. Chairman. Go right to the...
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Massachusetts and I want to welcome our the members who are here, and I would recognize at this time, if I can, the chairman of the Committee on Natural Resources, a gentleman from Washington, the gentleman, Mr. Holt from New Jersey, and the sponsor of the legislation, lead sponsor of this, the gentleman, Mr. Latta from Ohio. Mr. Latta, I'm going to have you go ahead and pull up a chair over here to the right of Mr. Holt. And as always, anything you have in writing will be entered into the record. We're delighted that you're here. Mr. Hastings, we still miss you on the committee. Your years that you and I sat next to each other on both sides of this deck up here provided me with a great opportunity not only to be your friend, but to work on important activities of this committee, and we are delighted that you're without objection. Gentlemen, is recognized.
Sometimes we're here in the dead of the night, too. So
yes, sir.
I see that Mr. Polis is not here, and I just wanted to say if nobody watched the happenings yesterday, the Seahawks won. I just wanted to mention that. And somebody today said, gee, they're hoping for a good game. And I says, I thought it was a good game. Chairman Sessions and members of the committee, thank you very much for holding this hearing on the consideration of H.R. 3590, the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, this is a bipartisan package. There's 8 individual bills. 6 of those bills have come out of my committee. And the goal of this legislation is to protect the traditional right of American sportsmen to fish and hunt without bureaucratic restrictions and limitations. This bill would remove government roadblocks to these activities on certain public lands and guard against new regulations that threaten or block access to hunting and fishing. By clarifying the law, it will also help to head off many of the anti-hunting, anti-nuisance lawsuits that are forcing our public land agencies to divert money away from taking care of the lands to instead defending litigation. It also reaffirms existing law barring the Environmental Protection Agency from banning traditional ammunition and fishing tackle and will protect against lawsuits and bureaucratic maneuvers aimed at undermining current law. Hunting, fishing, and shooting are long-standing American traditions and should not be threatened by the whims of bureaucrats. H.R. 3590 will ensure public lands remain open to these activities, except where there is a clear justification that lead to otherwise. Similar legislation passed the House in the last Congress with, I might add, bipartisan support, and I'm pleased to once again to see that this important issue is being advanced. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, it is sponsored and supported by bipartisan leaders of the Congressional Sportsman Caucus. Mr. Latta from Ohio is the chairman of that caucus, and Benny Thompson from Mississippi is the co-chairman. And along with Mr. Whitman of Virginia and Mr. Waltz of Minnesota, they are all original sponsors of this legislation. So thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Chairman Hastings, thank you very much. I really do appreciate your work on this endeavor and to move this to the committee and to the floor. Your leadership is not only appreciated, but respected also. The gentleman from Ohio is now recognized the main sponsor of the bill. Mr. Latta, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and really appreciate the opportunity to be before you today. And I'm pleased to be here before the Rules Committee today as the sponsor of H.R. 3590, the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreation Enhancement Act, or SHARE Act. I've introduced this legislation on behalf of the Congressional Sportsman's Caucus, which, if I could just add, is the largest caucus in Congress with almost 300 members, of which I am co-chairman with Congressman Benny Thompson from Mississippi. I'd like to thank Chairman Hastings for his support of the various bills contained in the Sportsman's Package, as well as Chairman Schuster and Chairman Upton. As a lifelong hunter and outdoorsman, issues relating to hunting and conservation are extremely important to me. This legislation includes various pro-sportsmen and sportswomen's items that will help ensure our outdoor traditions are protected and advanced. The legislation also addresses some of the most current concerns of American hunters, recreational anglers, shooters, and trappers. If I could go through, as Chairman Sessions mentioned, the different titles, just briefly, there are 8 titles. Title I is the Hunting, Fishing, and Recreational Shooting Protection Act, H.R. 322, which is Congressman Jeff Miller's. This section excludes the ammunition and fishing tackle from Toxic Substances Control Act, leaving decisions about tackle and ammunition to state fish and game agencies and the Fish and Wildlife Service, who currently regulate ammo and tackle. This codifies that the EPA does not have ability to regulate tackle or ammunition. Title II is the Target Practice and Marksmanship Training Support Act, Congressman Duncan Hunter. This portion amends the Pittman-Robertson Act by adjusting the funding limitations. It also encourages federal land agencies to cooperate with state and local authorities to maintain shooting ranges. Title III, Public Land Filmings, was one of my provisions. This provision directs the Secretary of the Interior and Secretary of Agriculture for any film crew of 5 persons or fewer to require a permit or assess an annual fee of $200 for commercial filming activities or similar projects on federal lands and waterways administered by the Secretary. This prohibits the Secretary for persons holding such a permit from assessing any additional fee for commercial filming activities and similar projects that occur in those areas during public hours. Title IV is Congressman Young. This is the Polar Bear Conservation and Fairness Act. This allows for the Secretary to authorize permits for importation of approximately 40 legally harvested polar bears from approved populations in Canada before the 2008 ban. Title V is the Permanent Electronic Duck Stamp Act from Congressman Whitman. This next section would grant the Secretary of the Interior permanent authority to authorize any state or issue electronic duck stamps. It also outlines electronic duck stamp application requirements. It does not increase the current price of the federal duck stamp. Title VI is the Access to Water Resources Development Projects Act. This is Congressman Gibbs. Another provision prohibits the Secretary of the Army from promulgating or enforcing any regulation that prohibits an individual from possessing a firearm at a water resources development project administered by the Corps of Engineers if, 1, the individual is not otherwise prohibited from possessing the firearm, and 2, the possession of the firearm is in compliance with the law of the state in which the project is located. Title VII is the Wildlife Hunting and Heritage Conservation Council Advisory Committee of another of my sections. This bill, this part of the bill would also permanently establish the Wildlife and Hunting Heritage Conservation Council Advisory Committee to advise the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture on wildlife and habitat conservation, recreational hunting, and shooting. And finally, Title VIII is the Recreational Fishing and Hunting Heritage Opportunities Act. It would require the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service to keep their lands open to hunting, recreational fishing, and shooting, and facilitate the use of and access to federal public lands and waters for these activities pursuant to reasonable exceptions. And again, I appreciate the Chairman and the committee for allowing me to be here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Latta, thank you very much for your outlining of not only this package, but also the important legislation that is contained therein. And thank you very much. Mr. Holt, welcome. We're delighted that you're here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be here.
Gentleman's recognized.
And Chairman Sessions and Mr. McGovern and other members of the committee, I'm pleased to testify on the Sportsman's package of bills. You know, in the past, the Republican majority has criticized, in fact, railed against the packaging of bills as an affront to regular order. And yet this week the House will consider, with your blessing, 19 different bills cobbled together in 3 different legislative vehicles. And I would argue that there's not really a crisis in hunting, fishing, or shooting on public lands that would justify rushing this passage through the House. Lack of access, limitations on hunting, fishing, and shooting are not the pressing problems that we face. If we're really serious about addressing the pressing needs, habitat destruction, insect infestation, drought, wildfire, that really are at crisis levels on public lands, then we should be addressing those. But opportunities to hunt, fish, and shoot remain plentiful. More than 75% of public lands are open to these activities. In fact, the development on private lands forecloses recreational opportunities for the public. But federal lands make up a larger and larger percentage of the areas open. Beyond being unnecessary, several provisions in this package, I think, could do real harm to some of our pristine lands. Wilderness areas provide habitat and opportunities to hunt and fish, and unfortunately the package contains provisions based on the misconception that the Wilderness Act limits these activities. Language in Title III would allow the use of mechanized vehicles and equipment in wilderness as long as it is somehow related to filming. Language in Title VIII would allow construction of temporary roads and other facilities in wilderness as long as they're related to hunting and fishing. These provisions are not needed and do pose a real threat to wilderness conservation. Perhaps most troubling are the issues that the package fails to deal with. Programs like the North American Wetlands Conservation Act and the Land and Water Conservation Fund are popular and effective tools for preserving habitat and open space for outdoor recreation, and any serious proposal intended to preserve the American traditions of hunting and fishing would reauthorize these critical programs, and the package before you fails to do so. There are some amendments filed to include these programs, and we urge that they be made in order. The Land and Water Conservation Fund, for example, has a distinguished history, and $34 billion has been set aside with only less than half that much in federal expenditures. That program is set to expire in 2015, and it needs to be reauthorized. I have an amendment, also another amendment, that would address the most serious challenge facing not just our public lands, but our planet, and that is climate change. I hold my amendment to you for consideration. I think that for public lands and recreation on those lands, we should look at the changes that will occur at manifestations of climate change. Changes in hunting seasons, in migratory patterns, in native and invasive species populations, sea level rise, wildfire, drought, all have the potential to alter the landscapes and limit opportunities for hunting, fishing, and recreation far more than any of the items that are dealt with in this legislation. So I do ask that at least these two amendments that I have offered be made in order, but please take a look at the other amendments that would address the shortcomings of this legislation. Even better, the House should turn its attention away from this unnecessary package and seek bipartisan compromise on legislation that addresses the really pressing needs for our public lands. Thank you.
Mr. Holt, thank you very much. I appreciate you being here. This committee, as you know, always looks forward to not only you being here, but also the expert testimony that come from chairmen and those who bring bills before us today, and I'm delighted that you are here. Let me state for the record that occasionally as I speak, I want to make there are some things which I say which I do not want to be taken in a negative manner. I did refer to up front that this was a bipartisan, bicameral bill and that there had been work done with the administration. In no way did I mean to state that this administration would be supportive of all piece parts of the bill or the bill, but rather that I do know, because I was a part of some of the discussions, that the administration did take part in the discussions related to the bill. And so I wanted to make sure that I satisfy Mr. Cousins, my legislative director, who took strong offense to the way in which I overstated the work that the administration had performed on this endeavor, and I want to give full credit to the balance that comes from working with, asking consent with, and working with on answers that might resolve things. So I hope that the gentleman, Mr. Cousins from Texas, my legislative director of the Rules Committee, is happy now. Thank you, Mr. Cousins.
You answered my first question, too, so thank you.
So I answered the question from the ranking member and the legislative director of the Rules Committee, and I thank both of you for your assistance in that endeavor.
I think Chairman Hastings didn't want this characterized as an administration bill either.
You know,
No, but I thought this was an opportunity for them.
I would like to ask a question of the chairman of the committee. Chairman Hastings, you deal with a broad range of issues and things which come in from the West, are very much a part of your day-to-day life. You hear from groups all over the country, I'm sure on both sides of any sort of an equation. But I would like, if you could, just to address perhaps what I was speaking about, and that is working with the administration on resolving long-standing issues that helps them, and you referred to it, lawsuits, litigation, and trying to work with them. Do you have any comments that might be, without revealing, I'm not trying to get you to talk about the whole issues, but trying to work with the administration to resolve issues that have been longstanding in these issues, in the endeavor of the entire package? Do you
let me
comment on that?
let me just start with the premise that, from my point of view, all federal lands are designed to be multiple purpose unless Congress otherwise designates. I mean, that's the principle, I think, in every enabling act of Western states. By the way, in those enabling acts, they were promised that federal lands would be available for them to purchase. That's another sore spot with a lot of Western states. But that's where the tension, I think, comes from, is where different administrations then will interpret existing law, and as I mentioned in my opening statement, certain bureaucratic efforts tends to not allow these lands that have not been designated otherwise to be tied up and not used for what they're designed to be used for, and that's where the tension comes all the time. I know in our committee we have discussions on a regular basis with the very administration that has jurisdiction over some of these public lands. Sometimes they're fruitful and sometimes they're not. But then that's the way the legislative process. But I just want to emphasize again the first premise. If we respect the fact that unless Congress says otherwise, federal lands should be for multiple purpose, then you would see recreation, economic activity on those lands. I mean, one of the reasons that Western states, there's so much federal land is at the time that they became a state, each state is different. There probably wasn't a whole lot of, people didn't see a whole lot of economic future to these lands, so they stayed in, within the federal government. Well, times have changed for a lot of these states, and there is a lot of wealth that can be created and so forth. And in Congress, in their wisdom in the past, if they see something needs to be preserved, then they preserve it. That's the way it ought to be. But otherwise, it should be multiple purpose.
Well, thank you very much. I am a user of national parks as an Eagle Scout and a Scoutmaster for a number of years. I utilize them. National parks, whether it be Mount Rainier National Park in out of Seattle, where I climbed Mount Rainier years ago, or Big Bend National Park that I went to, or Guadalupe National Park. They provided me with the thrill of the outdoors, and I'd like for other people to have that same opportunity. And I'm delighted that you're there to protect both sides of that element, but err on the side of letting people use them for multiple use. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, Chairman. Mrs. Fox?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I love national parks also. My husband and I both, a few times that we really ever get a chance to travel, those are the places that we like to visit, and I cherish them. But I appreciate the work that's being done by the Chairman of the Natural Resources Committee and by Mr. Latta to bringing common sense policies to the use of federal land. And I actually think we need to do more of that. I don't have any questions, but I want to thank you for your good work.
Mr. McGovern?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief here. I think what frustrates me is that there are a lot of things in this package that probably could easily get bipartisan support, but then there's some non-starters in here that make it very difficult to get the kind of bipartisan support that would actually have this thing go forward. But anyway, you guys make the decisions, and I've always thought you don't have to agree on everything to agree on something, and the something that we agree on, we ought to move forward. But this thing is packed with some things that I think make it very difficult for me to support. But I just have one question, and that is about the rule. I assume we're not going to have an open rule, so I'm not even going to ask. But there are a number of amendments here that seem to me to make a lot of sense and that are germane. The one, Mr. Holt had a couple. I'm a co-sponsor of the one on the land that reauthorizes the Land and Water Conservation Fund for 5 years. That's a program that is incredibly important in all areas of this country. And from what I understand, I think it's germane to this bill, so I don't think it would require a waiver. And I would hope that my two friends from the majority here would support at least making that in order, or all germane amendments in order, given the fact that there aren't that many. And I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Well, Mr. McGovern, as the chairman mentioned, I did serve on this committee for 12 years, and I always thought that the wisdom of the committee when I served on it was exemplary, probably the highest it could ever be. Now that I'm on the other side of the aisle, I'm not sure I want to criticize that, so I will leave that I'll leave that wisdom up to the Rules Committee. But I will mention this, and I'm sure Mr. Holt will confirm it. We have markups on a regular basis, and typically when we have markups, obviously we consult with the minority on this. But I think every time we've had a markup of multiple bills out of my committee, a majority of those bills have been passed by unanimous consent out of the committee. In other words, we've worked together in a bipartisan way on bipartisan pieces of legislation and Democrat, Republican pieces of legislation. Vast majority of them go to the floor on suspension that comes out of our committee. And we're very proud of that part. But like any committee, you're going to have differences of opinion, and on these differences of opinion, I understand that, and that's why we're we're going through this process of getting a rule.
Well, again, I was kind of hoping you'd say that at the minimum, Mr. Holt's amendment on land and water conservation should be made in order, because I do remember when we were in the majority, I think many, yourself included, were not hesitant to criticize us when people were, in some cases, I think, unjustifiably cut out. And on this is germane. We're not asking for a waiver here.
Well,
I mean, because this is an important issue. And I say,
Gentleman, yield.
I have a yield.
It's my understanding that it is authorized till 2015.
Pardon me? That
It's my understanding that it's authorized till 2015.
Right,
It's also my
that
understanding.
program is not up for reauthorization for a couple of years. You know, I mean, there are other programs that haven't been reauthorized for 25 years that we haven't been doing.
But the other point, and I'm sorry, I'm only trying to offer clarification. I'm not trying to respond.
I'm glad the gentleman made that point.
And it's my understanding that the committee has made some provisions for looking at that to be prepared for that this next year. So I just simply offer that. I had, you know what, I read your mail.
Yeah.
And we went and did our homework on that. Your staff was very good to let us know, and we've looked at things.
No, and I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. But I think what makes me a little nervous is I got elected here I got elected in 1996. I think it was in 1997 or 98. I actually offered an amendment to kind of reconstitute the Land and Water Conservation Fund monies that were basically zeroed out in the appropriations bill when the GOP was in control back then. I don't know where. I think. You know, this is an important program. I think that if you brought it to the floor, I think there were a majority of members that would support it. I'm not sure how many on the Republican side would support it, but we have some Republican co-sponsors. I think enough to give it a majority, and so I'm very interested in seeing this thing survive and not put off to a point when potentially it could be killed. So again, I mean, it's germane. Makes sense that we ought to debate it, as well as a number of these other amendments too. And I appreciate the fact that the Resources Committee reports a lot of bills that are bipartisan that come up under suspension. But on some of these issues, there are people who are not on the Resources Committee who have very much of an interest in some of these issues, and I would hope we'd have an opportunity to debate a number of things. So
I thank the gentleman for raising that point, and I would argue that although it might be done some other year, it certainly fits, and we could do it now. There would be support for such an amendment. It was 1999, I'll remind the gentleman, because I had been here in office for a few months. And one of my proudest moments in my entire service has been to join you on the floor that day to revive the stateside matching program of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which has gone on to do important things. And it's not just in the western states. It is in Massachusetts and Florida and New Jersey, certainly the Delaware Water Gap and the Cape May National Wildlife Refuge and the Morristown National Historical Park and Gettysburg Military Park and Flight 93 Memorial. All of these have benefited from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. It is a great program where revenues from depletion of taxpayer-owned resources are applied to preservation of other resources. And so this would be a good opportunity to, as the gentleman from Massachusetts says, it'd be a good opportunity to make this in order and take care of it.
thank you, John.
Thank you.
You're back.
Thank you very much. I'll address the issue. I could either address it now. We can address it at the time the committee gets to it. By the way, I've been to almost every place you mentioned. Delaware Water Gap's one of my favorite places, and I appreciate the gentleman, and we'll find out if we need to address that at a later point. Thank you very much for bringing it up, and as always, your ideas and suggestions by this committee, no matter who you might be on the committee, are very helpful to a decision-making point, and as Chairman Hastings pointed out, he can disagree with us sometimes. It looks a little bit different from another side of the perspective. We're trying to add the balance that he spoke about during his 12 years of service to this Congress on this committee. Thank you very much. Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you. Let me start by simply putting an element of caution in our dialogue so far. We've already had 2 members who have extolled our national parks. I appreciate that, but just remember the national parks are only 13% of what the federal government owns. They happen to be in 49 of the 50 states, and Delaware is frantically trying to find something worthy of a park, but that's one of the reasons everyone thinks of parks when you say national public land. Problem is, 45% of everything we own is BLM property, and that's only in the West. So when you guys think of a pretty tree by a lake in a national park, we think of sagebrush rolling along a barren hill, which is what most of the land the federal government owns, and that's where the problem really where it has developed, especially on BLM land. But we've also had problems with national parks, where every land manager somehow comes up with a different interpretation of what the acts are. So let me go through a couple of questions for all of you, and I'll talk about regular order in a minute, because I think that's, well, let me broach into that, because I'm not quite sure. I know that the parts that went through Interior have all gone through regular order. They've had either a hearing or a markup.
That's correct.
Which is vastly different than what you were emphasizing earlier, that when we objected to having a comprehensive bill dealing with public lands coming to us. The first one had over 80 different bills cobbled together. Right. The second one had over 100 bills cobbled together. The vast majority of those had never had a hearing in either the House or the Senate. They were thrown in an omnibus bill the first time. And I appreciate the gentleman from Washington who, when he took over, said, you have no, I assume you said that you have no problem with putting bills together, but they have to be at least heard somewhere at some time by somebody.
Right, and these have gone a step farther because they have in fact gotten out of committee. So they, but yes, I think it's important because there's always something, and the gentleman from Utah is a subcommittee chairman where the hearings are held. There is always something that comes up in the hearing that was not anticipated with a piece of legislation. Rarely do we get bills, even that are vastly they're supported on both sides or on a consent calendar, where there doesn't have to be some tweak to it, and that comes out generally at the hearings. And that's why, as chairman, I've always felt that hearing process is important.
Let me go through a couple, if I could, maybe like 3 quick questions that deal with some of the substance of why language is in here, which may be one of the reasons why these bills are before us. Mr. Hastings, I'll address for you. Maybe Mr. Latta wants to add on to this. It seems like in the mid-'70s, when I was still young and had color somewhere in my hair, Congress did deal in this particular issue of ammunition, dealing with whether it should be with EPA or some other group. Can you just...
Yeah, that, specifically, and in 1976, I comb my hair a lot differently, too. So, but in 1976, the law that Congress passed said very specifically that EPA had no authority within hunting and fishing. However, in the past, there's been and this is really under the jurisdiction of Energy and Commerce and not our committee, but there has been, so Mr. Latta can probably speak to it better than I can. So EPA has gone around the edges to say, okay, then we are going to regulate the stuff that goes in to hunting and fishing material, and that's where the debate has been. This provision in the bill simply clarifies that EPA does not have any authority for hunting and fishing. Very simple.
Do you want to add to that?
Well, thanks very much, and I thank the chairman. I think he summed it up quite well, but again, we're codifying it because, again, we're looking at the Fish and Wildlife Services in the states have a much better understanding with what we're dealing with here when you're talking about, you know, sinkers for fishing, or if you're at a trap or a skeet range, that's something that should be regulated by the state or by the Fish and Wildlife Services. And so, again, what we're doing is we're codifying that language.
I appreciate that. It seems sad that we sometimes have to restate what we have restated in the past, but sometimes there's a reason for that. I know part of the language in, I think, Title VIII deals with what is basically a restatement of language that's found in the Wilderness Act bill. However, I noticed that the Ninth Circuit Court, for example, took some of that language in the 64 Act and then basically reinterpreted that. So I'm making an assumption, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, that the purpose of this act is to merely state that we are reaffirming what the Congress intended to do, not necessarily what a circuit court intended to do.
While we've gotten away from it, the Constitution does say that the Congress will write the laws, and that's what we are saying with that provision. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, but that's just the Constitution.
Yeah,
Big deal.
Yeah, it's important. It's important
me-
piece of legislation, though.
Let me just ask one other question then, because there's also some language in here, I think in Title VIII, that mandates the NEPA process go through. So there's a reason, because usually my side doesn't like the NEPA process. Is there a reason why we would put that mandate in this particular piece of legislation?
Well, the reason for that is because any agency, when they're looking at something, will take a law, in this case NEPA, and then they'll close down whatever activity on that until they finish the NEPA process. This simply says it'll be open until closed. Getting back to the principle, multiple use unless Congress otherwise designates. And keep in mind, NEPA is it's an important law. There's a lot of discussion about it. I've certainly discussed it sometimes very negatively. But the principle ought to be, if federal lands are open, they should stay open until there is an ensuing decision that is made, not while the process is going on. That's where the conflict comes.
All right, and unfortunately that happens quite too frequently. When we had the hearing on what I think is Title VIII of your bill in our subcommittee, I think it was Mr. Benishek that noted, no, one of the witnesses noted that hunting and fishing in his part of Michigan, we usually think of Michigan as being Detroit, he's on the other end. His part of Michigan is a $90 million a year addition to their, $90 billion, I'm sorry, a year addition to their economy, just in excise taxes, and that doesn't count what it is for what we gain from hotels, gas stations, convenience stores, sales tax, all that other kind of activity. So hunting and fishing and ensuring that hunting and fishing and other type of recreation seems to me it is extremely important to a healthy economy. And yet we do have examples over and over again where administrators take an attitude in which they try to restrict recreation access in certain areas without having gone through the overall process like the NEPA process that's coming through. And that is a realistic occurrence that takes place, especially on that 44% of the land that's all in the western Utah, well, almost all western Utah, Western America. It's only 70% in my state. We're not bitter about that at all, which comes through. So I think that's important. If you
Well, I was just going to say, I think that $90 billion figure is a nationwide figure. I believe. I don't think it's a figure for Michigan. They'd solve a lot of problems if they just took a slice of that for Detroit, and that would solve their problems. But it is a big industry. There's no question, and the reason, and again, Mr. Latta can speak to this, but certainly from my perspective, the reason there's a need for this legislation is to provide certainty for that industry. When you have certainty as to what the rules and regulations are, I think the normal consequence of that is you're going to have more activity. When you have more activity, you have more people being involved, and obviously the revenues go up. So I think everybody benefits when you have certainty. That's what we were seeking to do here with this legislation, is to make sure there's certainty in the law.
All right, let me, and this time I will end. Let me just end by saying that, Mr. Holt, I will not be voting for your amendment. I will do anything I can to stop the amendment. Mr. McGovern, I apologize. The one on land and water conservation funds, simply because it is premature to do that. Secretary Jewell has said she would like to use that fund for other kinds of purposes in the future. I don't want to reauthorize it now when we have a whole bunch of people, including the administration, that want to look at this fund for other purposes other than what we are doing presently, which is one of the reasons why I want to go through the regular process, have the committees look at it, have the committees hearing, and not supersede that by trying to reauthorize a program right now, especially when the good secretary has some other ideas that should be advised.
Gentleman yield?
Do I have to?
You don't have to.
I'll give you 30 seconds. Go.
Yeah, I guess I wonder if the gentleman is kind of establishing a new standard that from now on the bills he's going to support that come before the Rules Committee have gone through hearings and markups before they come here, before we report them to the floor. I just wonder if there's a change of attitude here.
When I came here from the state of Utah, we always did that. And when I came here, I learned from those who were in charge, both on my side and on your side, that sometimes that is not a practical solution. So I have watched as the Democrats, when they were in power, did that same kind of thing. Not really crazy about it. I'm not crazy about it when we do it either. But I recognize flexibility sometimes has to take precedence. What I'm happy about this, the chairman of the Resources Committee is saying is that he doesn't want to do that in any kind of large omnibus bill until all of those pieces have had a hearing somewhere by someone at some time. But I found out that a hard and fast rule means that everyone violates it, so I'm not going to try and take that.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman, Florida, Judge Hastings recognized.
Thank you very much,
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Chairman. Since Natural Resources has reported on 6 of the 8 measures in this bill, that would mean that members are going to have to vote on 2 of them, at least H.R. 322 and 2046, the Recreational Land Self-Defense Act, without any hearings or markup. Is that correct?
I don't know what those committees did with those bills. I only know what our committee did with our bills. So I'm not.
Well,
I'm not familiar with that.
Arguably, then I would ask you, Mr. Chairman, if you don't know what they did, why did you put it in here?
Well, because they gave us a waiver to allow that to be in there. But keep in mind, on the one that deals with energy and commerce, that bill passed the House last year. Mm-hmm. So it's been acted on by the Congress. In fact, I think it's probably been acted on more than one occasion.
All right. Similar to the duck stamp provision, we voted on that, and it passed 401 to 0. So why are we voting on it again?
Well, sometimes, and I know you know the answer to this, and thank you for giving me such a softball, but you know that in order for legislation to pass, it has to pass the House and the Senate. Mm-hmm. We have passed a number of pieces of legislation out of this House and out of our committee that are sitting in the Senate.
Right.
And I wish that they would act on it. Now, I will say that we have had conversations with my counterparts in the Senate, and hopefully we can break some of that. But that's the reason we think these are important. There's a broad constituency that wants this, so that's why it's part of this package.
All right. When my colleague, Mr. McGovern, asked you, Mr. Chairman, whether you had an opinion about the rule, and you spoke of this committee being such an enlightened committee, particularly when you were here, and I tend to agree with that, if for no other reason that we share the same damn last name. But that said, you did rather at length have an opinion, and I don't think it is going to change that you rely so much on this committee, but you sure did tell us that you wanted us to grant a structured rule, and then you go on in your closing paragraph to ask that the rule made in order, make in order the introduced version of 3590, and that this version of the bill be considered as read. And I asked you to provide 1 hour of debate, evenly divided between the majority and the minority bill managers from the Committee on Natural Resources. And you asked to make in order under the rule the manager's amendment that makes several changes to the bill to reflect the amendments, and indicate that you forwarded it to the parliamentarian. So pretty obviously you did have, at least when Mr. McGovern asked you, a pretty firm opinion about whether or not this committee ought to follow that line. You still agree that those things are what this committee ought to do?
Well, I certainly have opinion on the amendments that I authored, like the manager's amendment. I mean, you'd be disappointed if I didn't have an opinion on that.
Right. Well,
I wasn't breaking any new ground when I said that the time for debate should be an hour. I can never remember very few times when this committee granted more than 1 hour on any measures. There are exceptions to everything.
Right.
And of course, then that, I think Mr. Bishop probably said, I do believe in an open process, and I think. But I do know that there's exceptions to everything, and I see a pattern going through. It started several Congresses ago, to my dismay, that we are getting more and more away from the open process, and so that's why I asked for the structured rule now.
Well, that's I concur with you, and it's regrettable that we tossing process to the wind. But as it pertains to this particular legislation, perhaps I should turn to my friend Mr. Latta. Since significant amount of federal land is already open to recreational hunting and fishing and shooting. And let me see if you quarrel with these statistics. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife reports that the number of sports persons rose from 33.9 million in 2006 to 37.4 million in 2011, including 31.1 million people who fished and 13.7 million who hunted. So forgive me if it doesn't just seem like this is taking pot shots at a straw man. And can you describe how sportsmen's heritage is being challenged such that this kind of legislation is required?
Well, thanks very much for the question. And, you know, I come from Ohio, and I was very fortunate.
I won't hold that against you.
Well,
it's great stuff.
As long as you're not from my northern tier up there, my friends from Michigan. But, you know, when we look at the state of Ohio, for instance, because I was very fortunate. I was in the General Assembly. I carried a lot of the Division of Wildlife bills, the natural resources bills. And in the state of Ohio, of all of our land, as you know, we've been hearing some of the members here speak today about, you know, their respective states. Ohio has 3% publicly owned land. 3%. Now that's everything. That's from federal, state, county, city, township. You go down the line. We have so everything, when you start getting west of the Mississippi, a lot of our lands out here are privately held. You get to the west, of course, then you, as the gentleman from Utah was saying, that I believe it was 70% is on the federal side. But what we want to make sure is what these bills are pointing out, and which you're seeing, is we want to make sure that this is codified into law. That a bureaucrat out there isn't able to come out and say, well, we're not going to allow this today and we're not going to allow that tomorrow. Because, again, as pointed out by the chairman of the committee, you know, it's over $90 billion is generated every year. And also, one of the things I always want to make sure is that you have that land that's always available. And part of that is because I guess I was very fortunate. My dad started me out when I was a kid, walking with him for pheasants and rabbits in northwest Ohio. But at the same time, I'm a hunter ed instructor in the state of Ohio. And one of the things we want to do is we want to get the kids off the couches and get them outside. And just, you know, I don't care if it's in the hunting or shooting or angling or just canoeing, you name it. I want kids outside. But we want to have as many opportunities out there as possible, and we have to have that land available. And so I think when you look through the different sections of the titles of the legislation, it's pointing out that we want to make sure that if it's from BLM or from CORE or whoever, that those opportunities are there and they're not being shut out.
I appreciate your answer, and I fundamentally agree with some of what you've said, but in many of its particulars, I disagree that there's a challenge to hunters and fisher persons when they are on the increase in our nation, and I just, for the life of me, don't see where the challenge is requiring this legislation. And I'm not alone. I have in hand a letter from the Wilderness Society over the signature of Chase Huntley, and I won't bore the committee by reading it all, but I will ask unanimous consent that it be put in the record, Mr. Chairman.
Objection. The letter will be entered to the record. Thank you.
And what Mr. Huntley, who is their senior government relations director, says is that the House is going to consider this measure, and their 500,000 members and supporters urge the opposition to same. And among the reasons that he cites to is that wilderness areas offer unparalleled hunting and fishing opportunities in large part because motorized recreation and development are not permitted. Opening wilderness areas to motorized vehicles and development would destroy the high-quality hunting and fishing opportunities these areas currently provide. Now, does this legislation, the question that I have coming off of what Mr. Huntley says in his letter, does this legislation authorize motorized vehicles, road constructions, and further development in these areas? Chairman?
I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
The answer is no.
it does not.
Nope.
All right, that's good to know. Then I'll let Mr. Huntley know that his fears should be allayed. But the end of his letter, he says, it does not include any of the dozens of locally supported bipartisan bills pending in the House that would safeguard essential fish and wildlife habitat and maintain access for quality hunting and fishing and boost local economies. Like you, Mr. Latta, I grew up hunting and fishing, and I have great appreciation for the need to have our young people involved responsibly in those activities. Regrettably, too few people are in the category that you are as teacher. In our society, as Chairman Hastings said earlier, things change. And when you were a boy and I was a boy and our fathers and my grandfather and uncles, it was unheard of. I had a BB gun at 7. I had a single-shot rifle at 12, 22. And it was almost a hanging crime if you pointed a gun at somebody when I was a child. And so you were taught that way. And the society has changed so radically today until it seems to be passé that children shoot each other. And while I have concern for them being in the outer doors and trained properly, I do feel that there is a strong problem with guns in our society, writ large, not in the sporting and hunting context, but it just seems to me, and quite honestly, I'm a whole lot more concerned about school shootings than I am duck shootings. And I don't seem to get the same vibe from my colleagues here, and we are about to become numb to these shootings that are occurring regularly. And I won't take it all the way out there because that isn't what you all are here about. But somewhere along the lines, if we're going to have everybody with guns, we ought to have a whole lot of training like you propose for the wilderness. We ought to have it generally. Otherwise, what we're doing is allowing a whole lot of fools with guns going all over our society. Down my way in the Keys, a man set up a shooting gallery in his backyard. And interestingly enough, Florida law permits that. And that's crazy. Now, it was a loophole, and he spotted the loophole, but I believe when people are doing things like that, that they're just asking for trouble. And our laws ought to be mindful of these kinds of loopholes that allow a whole lot of crazy people to be out there hunting and fishing for things that they shouldn't be hunting and fishing for, and hunting each other too often for my money. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Judge Hastings, thank you very much for your comments. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Chairman Cole's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take much time. I just want to thank the gentleman for the legislation. It's, as usual, well written, and I appreciate it very much, and I look forward to having the opportunity to vote for it when it reaches the floor. So thanks for your hard work. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields time. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I took the other conclusion from Mr. Hastings' quote about the number of hunters and fishers and the rising numbers. I think that's exactly why this legislation is so important, as as we become more and more crowded, having more and more opportunities to get out and be with our kids and be with our moms and dads and do those things. Yosemite happens to be one of my favorite places in the world, and I've watched as the number of campsites in the name of preserving a resource so that people can enjoy it, the number of campsites has grown smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. In the name of wilderness, lawsuits threatened against the Park Service to take the cables down that were originally put up by lovers of the wilderness so that it could be shared with all Americans. The cables up to the top of Half Dome, take those down so that virtually no American, save the most skilled technical climbers, would ever get that view again. There's absolutely a common sense pathway forward. I'm grateful to the committee for looking for that path. What do they say? All that's necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. I think all that's necessary for common sense ideas to fall by the wayside is for folks to continue to say their higher priorities, their higher priorities, their higher priorities, and things in time dedicated to these common sense ideas is time inappropriately allocated. I'm glad we're allocating that time today. I'm glad we're doing all of these bills that have already had these hearings in a large group, and I'm hoping it will make a difference on the Senate side. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. I'd like to engage the gentleman just for a second. I did not know that the cabling had been taken down from Half Dome. When I climbed it, the cabling was there.
In the spirit of your legislative director, Mr. Chairman, if I suggested that the cables have been taken down, I spoke incorrectly. That they have. There was a conversation within the Park Service about taking them down. Lawsuits threatened to take them down. Rather than taking them down, they have restricted the number of climbers from what used to be about 1,200 a day down to 225 hikers and 75 backpackers.
Wow. Well, I was probably one of those in a larger train. You know, this Robert Cousins has had a profound effect on us today, so we need to be careful with that. We need to be careful with that. I thank the gentleman. Yes, sir. I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Nugent's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me, and I hope I don't have to be corrected. But just to Mr. Hastings' point as it relates to hunting licenses, I will tell you, in the state of Florida, since 1975, anyone born after 75 has to go through a hunter safety course before they can get a hunting license and show that, in particular, just because of the fact of what you point out. There's a lot of knuckleheads out there that go out hunting and probably shouldn't be, but the state of Florida has, or I think other states have also initiated those types of hunter safety programs, which is a plus. So I have no questions to the committee. I appreciate the legislation. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Orlando, Florida, Mr. Webster, you're recognized. Gentleman does not seek time. The chairwoman from Florida. No questions. The gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Burgess. Gentleman does not seek time. Thank you to all three of you for being here today. With great respect and appreciation, I know that the gentleman, Chairman Hastings, has been looking to do this. We engaged him last year, and he said it would be done at a proper time. I trusted your wisdom. Successful rain dance has a lot to do with timing. I thank all three of you. This panel is now excused. Yes, sir.
Hang on just for 1 second.
We expecting somebody else or just Mrs. Fox? Is that all we're waiting for? Okay. This now ends the hearing portion of H.R. 3590, the Sportsman Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act of 2013, known as the SHARE Act of 2013. The chairman will now be in receipt of a motion. Gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized, the Vice Chairman of the committee.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 3590, the Sportsman Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act of 2013, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill and provides it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule makes an order only those amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, and shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Now, I heard the motion by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. I will defer to myself to reinforce the things which are in the rule. The structured rule for consideration. It provides 1 hour of general debate controlled by the Committee on Natural Resources. It makes an order 11 amendments. 11 amendments that are generally split between Democratic and Republican sponsors, and it contains motion recommit to the minority, and I think that's a good overview. The committee will now be open to any amendment or discussion. Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee grant H.R. 3590 an open rule so that all members have the opportunity to offer amendments to the bill on the floor.
You've now heard the motion by the amendment by the gentleman from Massachusetts for an open rule. Further discussion? Those in favor of the Montgomery amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
No. The noes have it. Noes have it. Further amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
Gentleman's recognized.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment by Mr. Holt, myself, and others. Number 21, which would reauthorize the Land and Water Conservation Fund for 5 years. The LWCF uses revenues from oil and gas leasing on the Outer Continental Shelf to help preserve, develop, and ensure access to outdoor recreation resources. And just the mere discussion that we had that there are others, including some maybe in this administration, that might want to use this money for something else, I think highlights the urgency for us to act on this, because this is an important program and deserves our support.
Appreciate the amendment by the gentleman. Further discussion? Gentleman from Utah is recognized. Gentleman does not seek. I would. In fact, he has expressed an opinion, and I wanted to come back to him, recognizing that when he yielded back his time, when I thought he yielded back his time, I didn't want to cut the gentleman off. I would say to the committee that it is a very vital and important part of conservation and an understanding about relationships that people have. And I believe that the chairman of the committee had indicated that there would be not only a hearing, but on a bipartisan basis, an agreement for them to come up with a correct answer that would be timely next year before it seeks its demise through its scheduling process. So I would recommend a no vote. For discussion, seeing none, those in favor of the Montgomery amendment signify by saying aye. Those opposed,
aye.
No. Noes have it.
I ask for a roll call on that.
Gentleman asks for a roll call vote.
Ms. Fox?
No.
Ms. Fox? No. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop? No. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent? No. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster? No. Ms. Ross-Leitonen? No. Ms. Ross-Leitonen? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Ms. Slaughter? Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk for report total.
2 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, the...
Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me, gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Yeah, just one final discussion here. I'm sorry I was in my own dream world for a moment there. Just want to say the chairman said everything I would have said in much better style, and that a certain staffer from Texas told me not to say anything more. So since everyone else is throwing him under the bus, I will too.
You know, he'll get run over going and backing up, but I do appreciate the gentleman, but I was very sensitive, and I would be to any member of the committee if I accidentally or inadvertently, on purpose it's okay, but inadvertently or accidentally making a mistake not to recognize you, and I did after we had passed the gentleman recognize that perhaps he had not stated his case fully. I thank the gentleman very much. The vote will now be on the motion by the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Vice Chairman of the Committee, Mrs. Fox. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Gentleman asks for roll call vote.
Ms. Fox? Aye. Ms. Fox, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent, aye. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster, aye. Ms. Ross-Leitonen? Aye. Ms. Ross-Leitonen, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Slaughter? Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report total.
9 yeas, 2 nays.
Motion is agreed to. Motion is agreed to. And I will be handling this for the majority.
Then I will be handling it for the minority.
And the gentleman from Massachusetts will be handling for the minority. I need to advise the committee that the committee will meet tomorrow at 2 o'clock p.m. I didn't hear any applause. 2 o'clock tomorrow to consider 2 other natural resource bills. Seeing nothing further, committee, we're through with our work for the day. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.